Millionaire followed the homeless man who always asked for food, and what he saw changed his life forever. James Parker never imagined that his life would be turned upside down because of a simple request for food. But the moment he decided to follow Leo, a homeless man on the streets of Manhattan, he saw something that shouldn't be possible. Something that neither money nor luxury could give him. Something that would come from a man who apparently had nothing. What James saw there in just one afternoon made him question everything. His idea of success, happiness, and even life itself. What seemed to be just a simple good deed would soon transform into something much greater. What Leo revealed that day left James with a doubt that no one else could answer. And the decision he made afterwards will surprise you. James Parker, a man accustomed to a life of luxury and comfort, had never paid much attention to people on the streets. The city of Manhattan, with its grandeur, its lights, and its constant movement, was a place where he felt apart, distant from the reality of those who lived in the shadows of society. For him, the streets were just a backdrop for his routine as a successful businessman, a place where money and power gave him everything he desired. Every day, as he left his elegant office in the heart of New York, James would pass by Leo. Leo was a homeless man, like so many others who begged for alms on the sidewalks. His eyes, tired from the daily struggle for survival, were constantly ignored by those who passed by in a hurry, wrapped up in their own lives. Leo, however, didn't seem to be like the others. He didn't ask for money, didn't make desperate gestures. His request was always the same: just a little food, please. James had never paid much attention to this man. He saw Leo almost every day but passed quickly, avoiding eye contact, as if he were just another insignificant presence in his routine. For James, poverty on the streets was just a consequence of life, a reality that he couldn't or didn't want to change. But something happened that day. Something James never expected. As he left his office, he noticed Leo standing at the same spot as always. He was holding a small sign, made of old and crumpled paper, that said, "Food, please." For some reason, the sign caught James's attention in a strange way, almost like a calling. Perhaps it was the way Leo held the sign, or perhaps it was the calm expression on his face, but something made James slow down and look at the man in a different way. Instead of moving forward as he always did, James parked his luxury car at a corner of the street. He watched Leo for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. There was something in Leo's gaze that seemed to challenge him, as if saying, "I know you're watching me." And for the first time, James didn't feel comfortable simply ignoring him. He didn't know what he was feeling, but the simple fact of watching the homeless man seemed to cause an internal discomfort, a feeling of restlessness. It was as if a part of him was beginning to question his own life and the choices he had made. For a moment, James thought about getting out of the car and offering something, perhaps food, as Leo had asked. But he hesitated. After all, what could a man like James offer someone like Leo? He was a millionaire, a successful businessman, accustomed to dealing with numbers, contracts, and important meetings. He didn't know what to say to a homeless man, someone who wasn't part of his world. So he did what he always did, simply ignored the scene and turned his back. But something made him turn back. As he started the car, an inexplicable feeling made him stop. He looked back at Leo, and in that moment, something changed. He didn't know exactly what, but a small flame of curiosity ignited inside him. James thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he could be different that day. He didn't know if it was empathy, or maybe a desire to understand more about this man's life. But something inside him said that he couldn't simply move forward and let the scene pass without further ado. He turned off the engine and got out of the car. With slow and hesitant steps, James approached Leo. The homeless man watched him calmly, without expressing any surprise or excitement. He knew this was just another attempt by someone trying to understand his situation, another attempt that would end up being forgotten in minutes. "Do you want food?" James asked, his voice sounding strangely low and nervous, as if he didn't know how to communicate with someone so distant from his world. Leo nodded his head, a discreet smile on his face. "Yes, please. Just a little. I don't ask for much." James looked around and saw that no one else seemed to care. He looked at Leo's sign once more and, without knowing why, said, "I'll be right back." He went to the nearest store and bought a simple snack. When he returned, Leo was in the same place, watching the movement of the street with a disconcerting calm. James approached and handed the food to him. "Thank you," Leo said, accepting the food without showing great enthusiasm, but with a look of genuine gratitude. In that moment, something inside James awakened. He didn't know if it was Leo's look or the simple act of giving something to him, but the scene was engraved in his mind. He felt touched in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't Leo's gratitude that touched him, but the fact that Leo didn't seem to want anything beyond a simple gesture of kindness. And that, for James, was something much deeper than he could imagine. He slowly walked away, returning to his car. But as he drove home, the scene of Leo and his calm look wouldn't leave his head. He didn't know why, but something was changing inside him. Something that made him question his own life and what really mattered. And without realizing it, James had taken the first step on a journey that would change everything. In the following days, something began to change in James Parker's routine. He couldn't stop thinking about Leo. The scene of that homeless man, sitting on the street with a serene look holding a simple sign, began to invade his mind in a disconcerting way. It wasn't Leo's poverty that affected him, nor his desperate situation. What really bothered James was the fact that Leo didn't seem to be living in despair. There was an inexplicable calm in his eyes, a tranquility that defied everything James knew about life on the streets. He was accustomed to seeing the homeless as victims of a failed system, people who were there due to wrong decisions or a cruel fate. But Leo seemed different. He didn't behave like the other people James saw every day. There was no anger, there was no despair. There was only a silent acceptance of his situation and a sense of peace, almost as if he had made peace with his reality. That night, upon arriving home, James tried to push these thoughts away. He had an important conference the next day, had commitments to fulfill, and the corporate world awaited him. But something in his chest bothered him, a feeling of restlessness that he couldn't understand. He got up from the desk where he was working and approached the window. The city out there was alive, pulsating, but something seemed empty, as if New York's reality were a facade, a curtain that hid something much deeper. James remembered Leo, with his serene gaze waiting for a plate of food, and he decided he would follow him. He didn't know exactly why. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the need to understand what was hidden behind those eyes. But that night, he knew he could no longer ignore the man who had caused him so much impact. The next day, James didn't take the same route as always. Instead of heading to his office, he decided to go to the street where he had seen Leo. When he arrived there, the place was empty. Leo was no longer in sight. For a moment, James felt a pang of frustration. He wondered if it had been an illusion, if his curiosity had led him to a place without answers. But he didn't give up. He parked the car and decided to walk through the busy streets of Manhattan, with his eyes attentive in search of Leo. Hours passed, and James walked through almost the entire area, observing every corner, every alley. Nothing. It was as if Leo had disappeared, as if he had never existed. Just when James was about to give up, he saw him. Leo was sitting on a distant sidewalk, with the same calm eyes and the sign in his hands. James hesitated. He knew that what he was doing was strange. He had no reason to follow Leo, and in fact he had never done anything like this before. But something inside him pulled him, something he couldn't understand. Without thinking much, James crossed the street and approached Leo. "Hi," he said, trying to hide the hesitation in his voice. Leo raised his eyes and looked at him with the same serene expression as always. "Hi," he replied, with the softness that James was beginning to recognize as his trademark. James sat down beside him, not knowing exactly what to say. For a few minutes the two stayed there in silence, just watching the city. The movement around seemed so distant, so irrelevant, as if the two were in another world, a world where time didn't matter. "Why are you following me?" Leo asked with the same calmness. "You don't seem like the type of person who cares much about the streets." James felt a slight surprise at the question. No one had ever challenged him so directly, much less someone like Leo. "I don't know," he said, the words coming out without much logic. "Something about you caught my attention." Leo didn't smile or make any gesture. He just nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. "Many people look at me, but almost no one really sees." He paused, and James felt there was more there. Something unsaid. Something deep. Sometimes people are afraid to see, because when you see, you feel obliged to do something. And doing something, my friend, is what changes things. Leo's words resonated in James's mind. He remained silent for a while, absorbing what he had just heard. It wasn't a life lesson. It wasn't a lecture about charity or kindness. It was something much simpler and at the same time, much more complex. Leo's gaze was challenging James to see the world in another way, to rethink everything he knew about success, wealth, and humanity. And in that moment, James felt that something was changing inside him. He didn't know what exactly, but he knew he could no longer ignore that feeling of restlessness that had accompanied him since the initial encounter. Curiosity was transforming into something bigger, into a need to understand not only Leo's life but his own life as well. He got up slowly, feeling a sensation of discomfort, as if he were about to make an important decision. "I'll come back tomorrow," James said, his voice now firmer as if he had made a promise to himself. "And I want to know more about you. I want to understand why you're here." Leo just looked at him, a look that seemed to say everything without words. "I'll be here. But the question is, will you be?" The next day, James didn't hesitate. He got up early, as usual, and went directly to the place where he had seen Leo last time. He was nervous, a little anxious. It wasn't as if he were going to visit a friend. In fact, he didn't even know if he could really consider Leo as someone he knew. But the truth was that, over the last few hours, the simple idea of Leo had transformed into a kind of silent obsession for James. He parked the car a few blocks from where he had found Leo the last time. As he walked through the busy streets of Manhattan, James's steps seemed heavier than normal. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something inside him propelled him to continue. He wondered if Leo was really there, or if he was, in fact, just a passing figure, someone who would never appear again, like so many others. But, to his surprise, when James turned the corner, there was Leo, in the same place, sitting on his sidewalk. The man had the same calm eyes and the same serene expression, as if nothing in the world could disturb him. As if he were untouched by the rush of the city, by the pressure of people passing by in a hurry, seeking something they could never reach. James felt a strange sensation seeing him there again. He had already observed him from afar, but now he was facing him more closely. He had never stopped to think about what the life of someone like Leo would be like. He was accustomed to seeing the homeless as victims of a cruel society. They were people who were there due to some kind of failure, whether in the system or in the choices they made. But Leo didn't fit that stereotype. When James approached, Leo raised his eyes and looked at him, as if he were waiting for him. Leo's look wasn't of surprise nor of happiness. It was simply a look from someone who was already accustomed to being observed, to being studied, and somehow, this made James feel like an intruder, as if he had no right to be there. "You came back," Leo said without hurry, without excessive emotion, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I knew you would come back. After all, you're still trying to understand, aren't you?" James hesitated for a moment. He wanted to say something that explained why he was there, but the words wouldn't come out. It was as if everything he thought was too small to be said aloud. So, he just nodded. "Yes," he finally said, his voice a little lower. "I can't get you out of my head." Leo smiled slightly, a discreet smile but somehow comforting. "I understand. I've been through this too. When someone starts to see things in a new way, it's as if the world becomes heavier, but also more true. It's not easy to deal with that. James sat down beside Leo, a gesture he had never thought of doing before. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but the idea of being there, with that man, seemed somehow right. He looked at the busy streets, at the people passing by in a hurry without noticing what was happening right beside them. To them, Leo was just another face lost in the crowd. "Have you ever thought about leaving here?" James asked, looking at Leo. "I can help you. There are places where you can find a job, a house, something. You don't have to live here anymore." Leo looked at James with slight curiosity, but without the surprise James expected. "Leave here?" he repeated, the word hanging in the air. "Do you really think that's what I want? Do you think I don't know what I can do? But what I want has nothing to do with leaving here, James. What I want is to live in a way that has meaning. It doesn't matter where I am." James fell silent, processing Leo's words. He was trying to understand what the homeless man meant. It didn't make sense. How could someone be so calm, so resigned to a life of poverty and helplessness? He couldn't understand. "But what about the future?" James asked, his words coming out hesitantly. "Don't you worry about what will happen tomorrow, or a month from now." Leo smiled again, but this time with an intensity that made James feel uncomfortable. "The future? The future is an illusion that people create for themselves. They get lost in plans and dreams, forgetting that what really matters is what you do today in this moment. I can't worry about tomorrow, James. Only about what I can do now." James found himself in a moment of reflection. Leo wasn't like the other homeless people he had met. He wasn't asking for money, not even for a chance to change his life. He was simply living, accepting life as it was, with a level of peace that James had never known. You seem so at peace," James said, not believing the words he was saying. "How can you be like this, with everything that happens around you?" Leo looked at him, his gaze fixed and serious. "Because true peace doesn't come from changing what's around us, but from changing what's inside us." James fell silent, immersed in Leo's words. He felt a growing restlessness inside himself. How could a homeless man teach something so profound to someone like him? Someone who had always believed that life came down to work, wealth, and achievements. And it was in that moment that James realized that Leo was offering him something much more valuable than any amount of money or success could offer. He was offering a new way of seeing the world, a way of seeing life that challenged everything James had known until then. In the days that followed, James couldn't distance himself from the idea of Leo. Every time he left his luxury apartment, his path inevitably led him to that busy street in Manhattan. He observed from afar, feeling like a spectator, as if he were watching a play where the plot made no sense at all, but where he couldn't stop participating. The luxury of his life, his meetings and commitments, seemed to have lost their shine. What mattered most now was understanding Leo, the homeless man who apparently possessed a peace that James never knew existed. The next morning, James decided that this time it wouldn't be just another casual visit. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand why Leo seemed to be so different from everyone else. He knew that by understanding Leo's story, perhaps he could understand something crucial about himself, something that was missing in his own life. When he arrived at the street where Leo used to sit, something was different. Leo wasn't there. James felt a slight pang of frustration. There was something disconcerting about that absence, as if the simple fact of seeing Leo was what made him feel anchored, as if his presence were a kind of guide. But James couldn't give up so easily. He scanned the street with attentive eyes. That's when he saw him. Leo was on a corner, far from the usual spot where he used to ask for food. He was sitting on a bench looking at the horizon with a thoughtful expression. Something in that scene seemed even more introspective, as if Leo were waiting for James to find him. James approached slowly, a little more confused than before. He didn't know how to start the conversation, but he knew he could no longer stay out. He sat down beside Leo, and again, the silence between the two was palpable. James felt as if the simple fact of being there with Leo was forcing him to confront something inside himself that he never wanted to face. "Why are you here, Leo?" James asked, breaking the silence. But the words came out with a lightness he didn't expect. It wasn't a common question. He was no longer asking about food or about life on the streets. It was something deeper. Leo looked at him calmly, as if he were waiting for him to ask that question. There was no anger or frustration in Leo's eyes, just a tranquility that James still couldn't understand. He didn't respond immediately, but the silence seemed to be the answer James so desperately sought. "I'm here because this is where I chose to be," Leo finally said with immense calmness in his voice. "I know that for you this doesn't make sense. How does someone who has so much choose to live like this? But the truth, James, is that life isn't about what you have, but about what you are. Most people are so busy running after something that will never fill the void inside them that they end up forgetting what really matters." James felt a pang of discomfort. He didn't know what to say, but something in Leo's words struck him deeply. He was accustomed to living to accumulate more money, more success, more recognition. But what Leo was saying didn't fit into that mold. It was as if Leo had accessed a level of understanding that he himself had never even considered. "But why live like this then?" James asked, his voice now lower, more vulnerable. "Why not try to change your life? You have so much potential. If I had your intelligence, your ability to connect with people, I would do anything to get out of this situation." Leo looked directly at James as if he were reading his soul. "Do you think life is about potential? About what you can do to achieve something? I could leave here tomorrow. I could go back to having a job, a house, everything you have. But that wouldn't change what's inside me. What matters, James, isn't where you are or what you have, it's who you become. You can have everything, but if you don't know who you are, you'll always be lost." Leo's words fell like a weight on James's heart. He had never really stopped to think about what it meant to be someone. He had always seen himself as the product of what he had achieved, of what he was capable of accumulating. But now, with those words from Leo resonating in his mind, he couldn't ignore the feeling that his life was empty. There was something missing, something that money couldn't fill, something he would never be able to find in his world of wealth and luxury. "I don't know how you can say that," James said, his voice full of confusion. "I see all your suffering, all your struggle to survive. How can you be at peace with that?" Leo smiled again, but now the smile was different. It wasn't a smile of conformity. It was a smile from someone who had found a greater truth, something that transcended pain and suffering. "Because, James, peace doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from learning to live with it. I'm not happy because I live an easy life. I'm happy because I accepted what I have, because I accepted who I am. I don't judge myself, and I don't care what people think about me." James felt a lump in his throat. He was beginning to understand, but still wasn't completely certain of what that meant. He had dedicated himself so much to the pursuit of success, of wealth, that he had never stopped to question whether that was really what he wanted, or if, somehow, he was losing something more important along the way. "I think I'm starting to understand," James said, almost to himself. "But this is still hard to accept." Leo looked at him with a look that was at once welcoming and firm. "Accepting doesn't mean liking. Accepting means understanding that you can't change everything, but you can change the way you react to everything. And that's what brings peace." James fell silent, feeling that he had taken an important step. Something was changing inside him, but it was still difficult to process. He didn't know how this would unfold, but he felt that this encounter with Leo was beginning to shape him in a way he never imagined. In the following days, James couldn't help but reflect on everything Leo had told him. His mind was in constant turmoil, trying to process and understand those words. How someone who had dedicated his life to seeking perfection in every aspect of his existence, from business to his personal relationships, now found himself questioning everything he believed to be the truth about life. It was as if Leo's presence, with his serene calm and his disconcerting words, had broken a glass, revealing something James had never noticed before, something that had been there all along, but that he had never had time to see. What really mattered, what really brought happiness, wasn't the relentless pursuit of more, but the acceptance of what you have in the present moment. Peace didn't come from having control of everything, but from understanding that not everything is under your control, and still living with gratitude. James began to feel the weight of his own choices, or the lack thereof. He wondered why he was so attached to the idea of always accumulating more money, more recognition, more success. What did that really mean? The life he had pursued so much seemed empty of purpose. Each business meeting, each financial decision, everything seemed to have lost meaning. He was so immersed in the game of having that he never stopped to ask why. And Leo, with his simple and honest way of living, was offering the answer. But the truth was hard to swallow. As much as James wanted to simply ignore the discomfort he felt, he knew he could no longer return to his old life. He could no longer be the man he was before. He felt there was something more in his existence, something he had been ignoring for years. He was beginning to understand that, to find true peace, he needed to let go of what he thought was important and open himself to what really mattered. One day, James decided to go deeper. He sat with Leo again, no longer with the intention of simply asking questions, but with the intention of listening. Really listening. He knew he was entering unknown territory, but felt he needed this to understand what was missing in his life. "I don't understand," James began, once again with a soft voice, as if he were sharing a secret thought. "I've always sought something that would give me a feeling of fulfillment, of success. I did everything they told me I should do, and I have everything: money, power, a successful career. And yet, something is missing. Something I can't name." Leo, sitting beside him, looked at him without hurrying to respond. He seemed to absorb James's words with the same calmness as always. There was something profound in his silence, something that spoke more than any words could express. "You got lost searching for what you thought was important," Leo finally replied, his voice soft but firm. "The problem, James, is that you searched outside yourself. You sought in the world what can only be found within you." James felt a weight in Leo's words. As someone who had always tried to shape his reality around him, he was now beginning to understand that perhaps he had been looking at the wrong things. He had sought happiness in material goods, in status, in recognition. But Leo was showing him a simple but powerful truth. Happiness is not something you achieve. It's not in a full bank account or in a prestigious job title. It comes from within. "I don't know if I can change that," James confessed, his gaze full of doubt. "I've always been taught to fight for everything I want, to never stop pursuing my goals. But now, everything seems so empty." Leo smiled softly, a smile that wasn't one of pity, but of understanding. He knew this wasn't easy for James, and in fact he didn't expect James to change overnight. But what Leo was offering wasn't a quick or easy solution. It was a journey, a transformation that could only happen with time. "It's normal to feel that you can't change, James," Leo said with a welcoming tone. "But change doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be an event that happens suddenly. Real change begins with small choices. You don't need to abandon everything at once, but you need to start looking at the world and at yourself in a different way." These words from Leo marked James in a profound way. He knew the journey he was beginning wouldn't be easy, but he felt for the first time in a long time that perhaps it was the only journey that really mattered. He had given his entire being to the pursuit of success, but what he now needed was to find a deeper purpose. He didn't know exactly how this would happen, but he was willing to try. In the following days, James began to make changes in his life. Small, but significant. He began to realize that while he continued with his business commitments, there was something more he could do to connect with people. He began to spend more time listening to others, really listening, and not just waiting to speak or to be heard. He began to ask deeper questions about what really mattered, not just for him, but for those around him. And most importantly, he began to question himself. Why was he doing all this? What was the true purpose behind his relentless pursuit? As James reflected on these questions, he felt a slight change inside himself. Something that before seemed like a void now began to be filled with a new understanding. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew that something inside him was transforming. And for the first time, he felt that even in the midst of the rush and distractions of modern life, he could find something more. Peace. Perhaps, just perhaps, he already had everything he needed, and just needed to learn to see the world in a different way. As the days passed, the transformation that James was beginning to experience in his life became more evident, but also more difficult to accept. He found himself at an emotional crossroads, where his old life, with all its luxuries and achievements, still called to him, but now seemed empty, like a stage without actors. He spent his days in the office, sitting in important meetings, solving contracts and market strategies, but his mind was no longer there. It was somewhere else, with Leo, on the streets of Manhattan, and in the simple words that had begun to reconfigure his understanding of what it really meant to live. James felt a growing discomfort when faced with the elements of his old routine. He looked at his luxury car and felt a slight revulsion. He entered meetings with investors, and while talking about growth, profit, and expansion, he could no longer see these objectives with the same eyes. Everything now seemed like an empty game, an insatiable pursuit of more, without end, and, more importantly, without purpose. But what he couldn't avoid was the feeling of inner conflict. The luxury of his life still offered comfort, stability, and status. He knew that by giving this up, he was launching himself into unknown territory, something he never imagined exploring. He didn't know how to change his life once and for all, nor what he should do to align his pursuit of happiness with the new understanding that Leo had given him. In the days that followed, James found himself divided. He spent hours looking at his company, at the financial results, and thought, if I abandon everything, what will I have left? What else can I do? It was a constant doubt that accompanied him wherever he went. He knew Leo was right about one thing. Happiness wasn't about what he possessed, but about who he was. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the life he had built, although empty, was safe. It provided comfort, respect, and recognition. And by taking this step toward a simpler and truer life, he feared losing everything. Leo had given him such a profound perspective, and at the same time, so simple. He wasn't asking James to abandon his ambitions or the success he had achieved, but Leo had shown him that to live fully, James would need to leave behind the fear of not being enough, of not being admired. True happiness, Leo had taught him, came from self-acceptance, and not from the constant search for external validation. But while James walked toward this new understanding, he found himself increasingly divided. Life in the office called him back with its promises of growth and stability. He thought about the achievements he could still reach, the luxury he could still enjoy. He wondered if it would be worth giving up all this for something more intangible, harder to measure. It was during one of these moments of reflection that James realized something he had never really considered. His happiness had always had to be measured by something external. He had become accustomed to living life based on external expectations, money, recognition, respect. But what he had never done before was stop to consider what he really wanted. What did he really desire from life? Not what others said he should want, but what he, James Parker, truly wanted for himself. He remembered Leo's words. You don't need to abandon everything at once. Start with small choices. And somehow, this brought a sense of relief. Perhaps it wasn't necessary to make a drastic decision. Perhaps change was something he could do gradually, one decision at a time. He didn't need to abandon his career, nor the lifestyle he had built, but he also couldn't ignore the void he felt by following only the traditional paths of life he had always known. One afternoon, after another day of meetings and decisions, James went to the street where he had met Leo. He knew the homeless man would be there, in his usual place. He didn't know what he wanted to find, but felt he needed to see Leo once more. When he arrived there, he found Leo, as usual, sitting on a bench, observing the movement of the city with profound calm. James approached and sat beside him without words, just observing the busy street. He didn't know what to say. The conflict was still present, but he felt he needed to be honest with himself. He looked at Leo and on impulse said, "I'm lost, Leo. I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I always thought seemed right, but now, it seems empty. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to continue, but another part of me knows I can't go on like this." Leo looked at James with a gentle smile, but nothing more was said. Leo's gaze wasn't one of judgment, but of understanding. He knew what James was facing. He knew how difficult it was to let go of something so familiar, even if it was no longer what really fulfilled him. "You don't need to decide everything at once," Leo said calmly, with the wisdom of someone who had already faced this type of dilemma. Change is a process. It's not about abandoning everything. It's about starting to choose what really matters. And when you know what that is, change will come naturally. James fell silent, looking at Leo, and then, for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of calm. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need them. What he needed was to take small steps in the right direction, with courage and confidence that the journey would take him where he really needed to be. James knew that the decision he was about to make would change his life forever. He didn't know exactly what would happen, but somehow that didn't matter anymore. What really mattered was that he had finally taken the first step to live more authentically, to seek something deeper than the relentless pursuit of status, money, and success. He could no longer ignore the feeling of emptiness that accompanied him, nor the silent peace that Leo, the homeless man, radiated with his acceptance of everything life offered him. That morning, James woke up with a feeling of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He was ready to make a choice, not a big choice all at once, but a significant move to change his way of living. He didn't need to abandon his career or his life, but he knew he could no longer continue living as before. What he needed was to make peace with himself, to accept that true happiness wasn't in conquering more, but in living fully, in being genuine and honest with himself and others. He drove to the center of Manhattan, where he knew Leo would be waiting. He didn't know exactly what he would say to him, but felt he needed to thank him somehow. Leo, with his serene calm, had shown him something that no money or success could give him: true inner peace. When he arrived at the street where Leo was, James stood still for a moment, looking at him. The man was on the same bench as always, with that calm look and a slight expression of satisfaction. There was no hurry in his expression. There was no apathy, just an unconditional acceptance of life. James approached, feeling a sense of familiarity, as if it were a safe place, away from the confusion and rush of the world. "I don't know what to say, Leo," James began, his voice low and reflective. "I feel that the life I've lived until now isn't the life I want to continue living. You made me see things in a different way. I don't have all the answers, but now I know I can no longer live as if success were everything. I need to change. I need to find something that's more genuine." Leo looked at James, a look that wasn't of surprise or joy, but of deep understanding. He knew James was going through a process of transformation, and that didn't happen overnight. It was a path James would have to walk by himself, a path that would begin with the decision to look at life in a new way. "You don't need to know everything at once, James," Leo said calmly. "Life is about small steps. True change isn't grandiose. It comes from within. What you need is to start living according to what you believe to be true, and that will take you to places you can't even imagine." James felt a lump in his throat hearing these words. He looked at Leo, and for the first time he didn't feel sorry for him. Instead, he felt a deep admiration and respect. Leo, the homeless man, had a wisdom that James, with all his wealth and success, had never achieved. He was beginning to understand what it really meant to live a full and meaningful life. I want to start," James finally said, his words being spoken with more certainty than he imagined possible. "I don't know what it will be like, nor where to begin. But I want to try. I want to learn to live in a more truthful way." Leo smiled, but it wasn't a smile from someone who knew more than the other. It was a smile from someone who was sharing the little he knew, hoping the other person would find their own path. He got up from the bench and put his hand on James's shoulder, a simple gesture but full of meaning. "Then begin, James," Leo said. "Change starts with the first step. Now you already know what matters. Now live according to that." James watched Leo as he walked away, walking with the same calmness he always had. He didn't know where Leo was going, but he knew that somehow he wouldn't need to follow that path alone anymore. James looked at the busy streets of Manhattan, at the tall buildings and the rush around him, but felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. He was ready to change, to take small but meaningful steps toward what really mattered. In the days that followed, James made small but important decisions. He began to slow down, to look at the people around him with more attention. He stopped measuring his value based on what he possessed and began to evaluate the impact he caused in the lives of others. He dedicated himself to causes he had previously ignored, helping those who needed it, without expecting anything in return. He began to learn what it meant to be truly present, instead of always being in search of the next goal or the next achievement. The process of change wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But, as the months passed, James realized that the peace he felt beside Leo on that busy street was something he carried with him at all times. He no longer needed to be a slave to his own success. He no longer needed to live to prove something to others. He discovered that true freedom was in self-acceptance and in genuine connection with others. And so James Parker, the millionaire from Manhattan, began a new journey. A journey not of conquest, but of true transformation. He didn't know where this would take him, but now more than ever he was ready to live life the way that really mattered. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion in the comments below.